All right, everyone. It is high noon in Colorado. I am so happy to welcome you all to our February lecture in our lecture series for choral. We are the Colorado Resilience and Arts Lab, and we're here in Aurora, Colorado, on Anschutz campus. And we are a group of researchers, creative arts therapists, and arts experts, I would say. We have come together to create research around creative arts for healthcare providers to see if we can reduce burnout symptoms and create resilient strategies. So our research has been far-reaching. We're funded by the National Endowment of the Arts, and we are a combination of three entities. And I'm going to tell you those three entities right now. I am Catherine Reed. I am the manager of our Creative Arts Therapy program here at Children's Hospital, Colorado. So we are one entity of this trio of collaborators. The second is the University of Colorado, Denver, and that's Mark Moss as our primary investigator. He is really helping us create research tools and philosophical containers for our work. And then our third collaborator is Lighthouse Writers Workshop, a wonderful arts organization here in Denver, Colorado, doing all kinds of work with so many different populations with a focus on creative writing. So together we've devised a team of people who have written protocols and have created interventions for our healthcare providers here on the Anschutz campus and inviting people from around the Denver metro area. And we're really trying to set a standard nationally for how we can combine the efforts of our arts fields and our medical fields to create research that can really help not only the healthcare providers in our midst, but also generalize that to the broader population. So part of that effort is this lecture series, and we are excited to feature lecturers every month who are part of this community of looking at the arts to see how they are affecting society in both positive and, well, usually positive ways, but really find the data to make that researchable. Today, I am very excited to introduce our speaker. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Novak-Leonard. She is the Research Associate Professor and Research Director of the Arts Impact Initiative in the College of Fine and Applied Arts at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Novak-Leonard's work focuses on the social roles of arts, artists, and creativity, how they impact people and communities, and implications for policy and practice. Jennifer's research examines racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic inequities and outcomes and opportunities for arts, artists, and movements toward cultural democracy. She also serves as the research director and the board vice president of the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project, also called SNAP. So if you are listening today, I want to invite you to enter your questions during Dr. Novak-Leonard's lecture in our question answer section. Our chat section won't be available, but if you enter those questions that way, I will be sure to read them to her at the end of our hour together, and then we'll have a nice discussion, including all of your questions. So on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Novak-Leonard. I am handing it off to you.
Great. Thank you so very much, Catherine, and to the entire choral team for inviting me to speak with you today and to have time in your community. I greatly appreciate it. Hold on just one moment and I'll share my screen. Great. So as Catherine said, kind of my general research interests, because I just want to be able to situate myself within your community. I look broadly at art, artists, and creative practices. My kind of trajectory of work has looked very much at how they affect individuals and communities by varying definitions of what we mean by community. And very specifically, I try to look at what does that mean for the actual improvements, be that efficacy, be that efficiency in different ways, be that more equity-based in terms of professional practices. And I think very much about that from a systemic level in terms of policy. So that's kind of where my head has been is, and what I'm some of the perspective I'm hoping to provide to you today. Additionally, I mean, I just want to mention my roots, as Catherine mentioned about the choral team and their mixture of expertise in arts and in clinical fields and arts therapy. My roots are in the social sciences, working in both mixed methods of qualitative and quantitative. So that's where I'm going to be drawing from. I very much work in partnership with policy leaders and community folks. I'm very much thinking about how do we translate the questions that are most pressing in practice, think about the research that can help inform that, but also ensuring that that conversation is two-way, that we're also translating kind of the best and most insightful research to help for that implementation. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and that may be different than where your starting point is. But in our conversation today, you know, I have two aims. I'm really hoping to share the perspectives and framing that I'm bringing from my trajectory of work and looking at the synergies with the different places that each of you are starting from and coming from and your approaches to this area of work. And also thinking about the synergies and our different ways of knowing, kind of what is the different types of evidence bases that we need, are looking to have, are needed to go forward. You know, there's a lot of conversation, and I'll get into this a little bit more, about different kind of areas of critical mass of energy and efforts working in this space, and they may or may not be working in silo. But I'm really hopeful that throughout the conversation today and some of the points that you may bring up in the Q&A will help us kind of elucidate some of these synergies and the different ways of knowing about how arts can affect individuals and different types of communities and practices. So knowing, I'm going to try to cover a broad range of topics drawing from different studies that I've been a part of, and also reflecting on some studies that have come from my prior work. I'm really trying to distill that down into kind of three key questions that I want to try to cover in our time together today. Really kind of the what are we talking about when we're talking about arts? Kind of what that means and kind of the why do we care about these things? In what ways do they affect us or might they affect us? So the why that anchors a lot of this together. And then moving into the, you know, how do we know any of this is doing anything, and what is our current knowledge on that? So I'll be drawing from different pieces of my own work. I'd be happy to certainly to follow up with additional references and citations I may mention, but this is really will be kind of a survey perspective. So the what. So first, I'd love to actually engage you a bit because I know that you're in this interface very much. I'm talking to you, but I'd love for you to use the Q&A as vehicle to respond to this question. So people are involved in different types of activities that they enjoy or that are important to them. Please briefly tell me about any creative, cultural, or artistic activities that you do. And if you wouldn't mind, just briefly drop some of those ideas and what are some of the things that you do that you find important or that you enjoy into the Q&A. And if I'm not able to see that, Catherine's going to help me out with sharing some of those for all of us to hear.
Jennifer, I am seeing photography, time and nature, the outdoors. I know for myself, I will say painting in my studio and also going to movies and plays when possible. Who else?
Fantastic. I'm seeing a couple of things: live music, attending theater, cooking, crafts. I'm just kind of doing a quick scan here. Comedy shows, nature centers, dance with myself. I've taken up swing dance classes, trying to tap back into something that I really enjoy. Great, keep them coming, but really think about what is it that you enjoy and what you find important. So thank you for sharing these ideas and what is important to you. We're going to come back to this in just a few moments. So thinking about all these things that we've just briefly chatted about and commented on. So the starting point from my perspective and thinking about what are we talking about in terms of arts and culture activity driven from that policy perspective. There used to be a tremendous focus on arts attendance. So people actually going out to performances by a particular set of activities or attending an art museum. These activities included jazz, classical music, opera, theater, non-musical. They're listed at the bottom of this chart. And this is kind of the aggregation of whether or not someone attended one of these types of arts events, was then collapsed together and utilized as our national statistic, really kind of what was the attendance at these benchmark arts events during the prior 12 months. This is kind of our key national statistic about kind of just how we were doing as a national society in terms of our engagement with arts and culture. And this really drove and anchored a great deal of policy discussions and discourse. And this is from the National Endowment. And one of the key things that was driving this policy discourse for a long time was the notion of this decline, that there weren't enough people attending these particular types of events. And also, why were the people who were attending these events primarily identified as white, as well educated, college education or above, and from higher income classes. So there was a conversation in the policy discourse for a long time, but there was really kind of deficit, being like, why weren't these other people coming to these events if you weren't coming? And so trying to understand, this was really limited kind of our perspective in terms of policy discourse. But let's think about that. And certainly some of the things that people introduced include these types of events, but by no means what we've been already chatting about is exclusive to these types of arts events and attendance. So let's think back to all these different things that we just chatted about. Our comedy shows, going to concerts, going to festivals, participating in theatrical experiences, dancing ourselves. And I and colleagues undertook efforts to think about how can we capture this? What is the evidence base for better understanding the range of activities that in some ways are important or meaningful to people, so we can have a better, broader discussion about the ways that these types of activities do indeed and can impact individuals. So this is kind of the results of a large-scale survey effort that's representative of the adult population in California that I did with colleagues at the University of Chicago. Really trying to break out, covering a broad range of activities that individuals reported. And I'll say that question that I just asked you was our priming question for the survey. And people noted things like making bow ties, designing bow ties, painting wooden figures, a whole sandblasting mirrors, a whole range of activities. And certainly in this approach, this was a survey approach, a general population survey for the state of California, we had to have close-ended questions to really understand what this activity was. So assessing what we kind of had put out against what people provided in their open ends, we covered about 85% of the activity that individuals self-reported and described in their own terms. The key things that we kind of missed in our process were more religious-based religious practices, and then individuals listing as sports. Those were kind of the two big things that we missed from what individuals were self-reporting. But what we see here is kind of really a broad range of the types of activities that are meaningful to people, the different types of modalities in which individuals engage, be that attending an event, be that creating themselves, be that obviously through online activity and through other mediated means. But what we really drew from this conversation, and a big takeaway from this, was the importance of art making, the doing, the active, a piece of the conversation that had not really been a part of the conversation from a policy discourse. So this really kind of helped open up that lens for consideration. This is just a fun one. As I mentioned before, I have a dance myself. And so this is what this is just another anecdote. This is an anecdote to help give you the sense of the array of the ways that people report themselves dancing, and just a broad range of dance forms. And if you harken back to those original benchmark indicators, it's only looking at attendance at ballet performances. So again, we can just underscore the variety of ways that people are interested in engaging in arts activity. Again, I'm offering this piece of evidence from the same survey in California that really helped kind of open up how we understand the ways people engage with arts and cultural activity, to underscore the importance of our understanding of making and doing. As I mentioned previously, people were focused on arts attendance. And that asked, previously our measures were about, did you do this or did you not do this? So this is an additional layer of asking about the frequency with which you engage in some of these activities. So you see on the right, the frequency with which people reported going to different arts events, and on the left, the frequency with which people reported making or doing a range of artistic activities. And the broad takeaway here is that we see that people engage more frequently with the arts making and doing. And there could be a whole host of reasons why, in terms of just when things are offered, in terms of events and other barriers or other logistics, certainly. But this really underscores the centrality of the art making and doing. Which brings it into the policy discourse where it previously had not been really dominant in that conversation. I just want to note here, drawing from that work in California, I was able to work with the National Endowment for the Arts to expand their national survey in terms of greater nuance, in terms of how they were collecting data on the activities that people were engaged with. And importantly, this serves as a stepping stone to better understanding the many different ways of what the potential impacts are on what people are doing when we're thinking about the general population. And importantly, as part of this conversation and trying to understand these different ranges of activities, it's also about what is the role that these activities play in people's lives and their motivations for being a part of these types of activities. And I want to offer this to you as well. And this quote is from the current chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson, who just earlier this week released a podcast. So I'll read this to you quickly. The point is being engaged in creativity and imagination, and that journey itself has value. It has value related to health, related to the discovery of your own potential as a maker. And I can go on and on about that because I feel strongly that our human participation in creative process is part of what makes us whole. So I offer this as a very brief way to kind of encapsulate almost about 15 years of work to really pivot the conversation from an arts attendance focus to a broadly encapsulating the range of activity, very much inclusive and emphasizing the role of art making and not just the product at the end, but can that process offer us in terms of these different types of potential benefits that Coral and others in this community are very much interested in trying to understand. So that was very briefly the what are we talking about and a very brief historical perspective on its evolution. And now that we have that as a baseline about the what, we really want to I want to offer some ways that we've tried to understand the why. Why and how is it meaningful to people to participate in these different types of activities? So if you would take a moment to think back on the activities that you offered in my opening question to you. And if you would, tell me, or if you would actually jot into the Q&A, what is it about them? Why do you enjoy them? And why are they important to you? And how do you describe that and how do you answer those questions? So feel free to jot your thoughts into the Q&A option on your screen. See, it makes someone feel good. Thank you for that. What are other ways that you would describe how it makes you feel? What are your words for that feeling? Thank you for all that you've offered us, feeling a sense of community, connection, wonder, processing, learning, understanding humanity, release from stressors. Thank you all for these offerings. So what we have found in our research and drawing from the different ways that people could describe these different range of activities, and people may be thinking about, different times I do things for different reasons, or maybe I get different things out of different types of activities or different contexts. I want to offer this. This is now almost 20 years old that I worked on with colleagues at the Rand Corporation at the time. And so this notion of what's the impact or what's the benefit or what's the effect of these different types of activities, it was very much coming from a policy discourse that had previously been very much focused on the economic impact of the arts from a societal perspective. There are political reasons for why that was the case over time, but it was a dominant focus on what is the economic impact of arts and what's that benefit. And this work really took a pivot, bringing it back to what is the why around how does it affect us as individuals? What is the meaning? What is that notion of intrinsic experience? And this is kind of the first model put out that connected to policy discourse to really pivot that language of valuing around what is that individual experience, that aesthetic experience, how does it affect us individually? And so then we see that is really where the focus on captivation, we hear that from Csikszentmihalyi's notion of flow, that notion of pleasure, capacity for empathy, this notion of social bonds, the notion of communal meeting, and some of these similar ideas are reflected in the comments that you shared as well. But when we think about it, the next question was, okay, if we have some language to describe this intrinsic experience, the question is, how do we start to measure it? And how do we think about that from a social science perspective, and particularly in relation to kind of what kind of measures have currency and policy discourse? So this is a model offered by a colleague, Alan Brown, that sought to expand that original model that came out from the RAND Corporation, that really tried to bring some nuance and additional dimensions to how do we understand this language, and how do we think about how these types of effects or experiences accumulate experiences or these types of impacts that are possible. So if we think about, you have kind of on the x-axis here, thinking about the individual who's had that experience, moving to these benefits of the impacts, expanding to social networks, and then thinking about a broader community, kind of a larger group, either defined by geography or perhaps an affiliation or association of some sort. And on the y-axis here, that notion of the immediacy of what might be being experienced during what an individual may be experiencing during an arts event or activity, how that might linger with them or have a longer impact over time. And then also what one might think about in terms of the cumulative. What does it mean to have these experiences on some frequency or with some regularity? Is there some sort of aggregation in terms of those types of impacts and effects that we feel as humans? So we have the imprint, kind of that very immediate individual level, kind of that more immediate experience here in terms of types of potential impacts. Very much thinking about the growth of personal development, social skills, creative competency, the ability to think, and different types of maturity in terms of emotional regulation and expression, and various facets of health and wellness. When we're thinking about a broader community experience, what does it mean for shared memory, different types of discourse, creation and feelings of sense of belonging in a community, stewardship and shared ownership and care for a community, and the different ways that we might experience that. And the notion certainly of the human interaction. What is that capacity for empathy? How is that conveyed? How does we think about enriching that network? How do we think about bolstering relationships in this network and notions of cohesion and teamwork? So this is kind of a conceptual model, really trying to expand what was in the brief model put out by the RAND report for Gifts and Use. So I'm going to go back here because this is kind of the starting point from thinking about it from our social science perspective. Like, how do we, if we have more refined language now, and a little bit of a clearer conceptual model of how these things might occur and what they might mean, how do we actually measure this in a meaningful way? Again, to have currency both for our own understanding and to also be a part of the policy discourse. So this is a brief snapshot of some of the measures that I have a body of work with Alan Brown on how do you actually ask these questions of individuals, because perhaps when you were answering my prior question, it felt easy to come up with language to describe the feelings that you've experienced. Maybe it was a challenge, but we also find sometimes people have a hard time, articulating what is it that they feel, do they know, and is sometimes the point to actually have that feeling and to not actually have the words for it. So the constructs that we utilize were very focused on social bonding, our connectedness to others, notions of intellectual stimulation, notions of spiritual value, not necessarily in a religious sense, but a notion of transcendence and empowerment and inspiration, an emotional resonance, certainly in terms of, it could be a broad range of emotions, but certainly the degree of empathy that one may feel during the experience, and that notion of captivation. In the rightmost column, you see some of the survey measures that we utilized. And very specifically, this developed focused on audiences. That seemed to be the easiest starting point. You have individuals who have, by and large, the same experience or exposure to a particular performance on stage. So we could have some consistency there. It's kind of, we could address and find that population to study. And we're able to kind of control that environment a little bit to be able to implement these research methods. Now, the translation of this to the notions of art making has been much more challenging due to the lack of those, by and large, the challenges around those things. I just have made it easier to be able to implement this focused on audiences. Now, these, I should say, underscore that these are relative scales measured on a Likert, because we don't know, there's not a 2 in terms of our social bonding, at least from the social science tools that are available, or intellectual stimulation, but these were really measured in terms of the relational measures of how much one did or did not experience that in relation to others' potential impacts. But then the question becomes, what do people say when you just ask them directly? And I want to share this quote that actually came from an individual who was part of the California survey that I led, when they asked, what is the value of the activities that you do? And that art is a way to cope with reality. Reality is too cold, and I couldn't live without art. So again, the challenges that we have are thinking about what is the nuance that you can get when we ask people for their own words, despite those challenges oftentimes that people encounter to articulate or to elucidate their own feelings in that regard. But what is the trade-off for a more standardized format when we're thinking about survey measures? So these are some of the challenges that we grapple with from a social science perspective of thinking about what is the meaning, what is the value, what is the impact, what is the effect of art on each of us when we experience it. Now, when asked that open-ended question in the California survey, these are the types of words that people utilize. And we saw 3 broad themes after doing a coding process from those open-ended responses. And I think some of this is also reflected in the terminology and the ideas that each of you shared. The notion of pleasure, enjoyment, it could be pure entertainment. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily. But this notion of being therapeutic, providing joy, relaxation, fun, happiness. Also, the dominance, the theme of connection, bringing us closer to loved ones or connecting with others in our community who are not in our regular network and with whom we interact. That notion of a broader, more macro notion of our shared humanity and spiritual connection. And the notion of accomplishment, of learning, recognition. Also, if one accomplished something, having that be recognized by others, and pride in the skills developed, not necessarily in the product produced, but the endeavor, reflecting back on Chair Jackson's words as well from the National Endowment for the Arts. So we have that trade-off of standardization from survey work that can provide us a more systematic, structured approach to thinking about how do we convey and understand impact or effects, but also that trade-off of the nuance and that we can better understand and clarity of ideas and reflection through an open-ended process. So I want to share, so reflecting on that, I did want to share that the survey of public participation in the arts was run by the National Endowment for the Arts in its most recently released wave, which was collected in 2017. There was one conducted in 22, but that data is not yet released, but is expected later this year. They did add in the ideas of kind of why do you do this? And kind of why the reasons for doing this is often thought about as kind of what is the value to individuals or people's self-acknowledged idea of how it affects them. And so there's a broad range of ideas to be social, to feel creatively inspired, to learn or experience something new. But for the very first time, we reflected on the notion of it being for health reasons. Now, this is tremendous to see this included and gives us a better understanding of how people are self-identifying, being involved in the varying activities for their own health, whether this reflects wellness, specific therapies, or for specific reasons. That nuance again is lost, but we can see that. And perhaps I think this is a great area to explore in the general population, and hopefully maybe there's an opportunity to learn more from the clinical work that's being undertaken. And I think, an outstanding question for some of the conversations that I'm a part of is really, interested to see how or whether this has moved at all, because the most recent survey was fielded in 22. So seeing if people are thinking about or seeking out art making activities in light of experiences throughout the pandemic, and all the other experiences that we've had, either the political environment and other factors, thinking about people needing, art making as an outlet. And I think this could be an indicator, at least on the national scale, to take a look at to see if people self-recognize that and report that in the survey instrument. So thinking back on this notion of, again, how do we know and what is the evidence base? I've talked very quickly and briefly about a range of surveys about how do we understand the range of activities that are meaningful to people? How do we put our arms around that and the various nuances that are there? Different ways in different types of research that we've attempted to put our arms around. What does it mean to people? Why do they do it? What is the effect of that? Recognizing that we have a long way to go to understand how to actually have consistent measures. To what degree are consistent measures helpful in comparison and supplement to a more nuanced, open-ended approach that better understand the language and concepts that individuals are wanting to use to express themselves? And the degree to whether and how that aggregates over time, and or over the broadening from an individual to the social networks to a larger community. There's much to be learned there. So what I'd like to share now for how do we know, is actually share a little bit from a broader literature review that I undertook with colleagues, really trying to understand what is the existing evidence base for many of these ideas of these potential benefits from arts engagement, ranging from that individual, more intrinsic experience all the way to the broader social economic experience. So it's quite wide ranging in terms of a scan of it, trying to assess an evidence base and what that means. And not only what the evidence base is, but importantly, to what degree does research exist to help identify the mechanisms through which it's working, for whom in terms of different populations, defined in varying different ways, and in what context? How do we know, or do we know, or is there an evidence base for the dosage? Is it attending one performance? Is it attending multiple performances? Is it regularly attending performances, for example? These are many outstanding questions when we try to think about what does it mean to engage with the arts, to look at it more systemically in terms of potential impact and effectiveness and benefits. So here's the literature review that we did. It's close to 200 pages long, but it's available online. I did it with colleagues at the University of Chicago. And here's the range and the ways that we organized how we tried to scan the literature. So really think about 3 levels of potential benefits and effects, thinking about the individual, notion of social groups and communities, in terms of looking at individuals, looking at notions of health and well-being, which I'll focus on in this conversation, looking at social groups in terms of those relationships and identity formation, particularly around that idea of sense of belonging, and thirdly, in terms of communities, defined both in terms of an expansion of social groups and identities, that think about communities and people, but also thinking about geography and communities and spaces. But I'll focus on individuals and social groups primarily. So as with any literature review, there were thousands of pieces initially identified that was culled down for a closer review. And so ultimately we had about 375 articles that were reviewed and that go into this work. Is it comprehensive? Absolutely not. Is it substantial? Yes, and hopefully informative as well. Now, importantly, because the literature that much of this work has been a part of over time in relationship to policy, whilst much of it is within academic journals, also a good portion of it is in gray literature. So we really try to span kind of what is happening in these different conversations in these different types of outlets. And I just want to use the way that we assess this may be different than what maybe some of you on this in the part of this conversation today are used to. Because this is a very evolving field, we see different knowledge and different information being generated in different spaces and places. We really took a look, try to use a lens of looking at the maturity of the evidence base to really try to assess it and really try not just if it's a good or bad or meet different thresholds, because they're quite varying in these different circumstances and context, which is quite starkly different on the many clinical fields. But really think about what is the maturity. And we assess the maturity both in terms of integrity, really thinking about how well does the research design match the goal and the question, is it transparent? So the basic nuts and bolts of the overall research approach. The next kind of lens and parameter for assessment was around volume. There are different kind of just levels of what people are talking about and kind of the notions of the level of critical mass that's been generated for some of these conversations. So we're just trying to take a look at kind of how much has this been discussed. Some of this is quite new from a social science perspective, at least. And then certainly the detail, how much variation are we able to talk about? Is it general population? Or is it looking at the different effects in different subpopulations? What degree of nuance and detail is provided? So looking across the rows here, certainly we had more emergent work because this is kind of a new area in many aspects. What is progressing? There's maybe a good deal of volume on the topic, but there's quite a degree of variation in what people are finding and understanding. Progressing in terms of the detail, certainly more advanced in hitting kind of all these marks. So I'll just speak to this briefly. I mean, certainly what we found is that the clinical fields are by far and away the most advanced in terms of the maturity of literature and study on the impact of arts, primarily through arts therapy and related literatures, both in terms of the rigor, variation in population, and general consensus in the ways that individuals are finding what the ultimate outcomes are. This is looking at it from a quite high level. So these other areas of social science may be offering different ways to think about what is the translation of what you all are learning in choral and some of the related work that others are undertaking to help connect with the social science perspective and thinking about what can we learn from what you all are undertaking and with related research to think about how to best inform what's being understood and approaches to understanding the general population in terms of these impacts. Certainly also in terms of health and well-being, thinking about, there's other measures thinking about cognitive functioning, how people feel about and rate their own health, as well as life expectancy. There's different approaches to that, but by and large, these are some of the most advanced literatures. And also very specifically using arts-based interventions to address depression, anxiety, stress, PTSD. Those were the most advanced literatures by far and away. Now, further questions become on what populations have these efforts been studied with? What is the degree and variation with the arts intervention that's undertaken or the arts experience that is documented as part of that exposure and that process and that treatment? So those are some of the things where it would be interesting to expand and think about the variations of the broad range of activities that are meaningful to individuals, and best to understand that. So that's where we have the connection. Now, in thinking about in terms of relationships, we definitely see a growing evidence base in terms in particular around notions of caretakers. So we've seen a good bit of kind of emergent and growing and becoming more advanced body of literature around relationships, certainly and very much focused on caretakers. Now, by and large, it was caretakers of older individuals or of those with children with various health complexities. But that notion of relief, also better strengthening the relationship between the caretaker and the patient or the family member who is being cared for, and that notion of strengthening relationships. Additionally, we saw an emergent growing body of literature around identities in terms of that sense of belonging and building community. We saw that there tended to be a growing critical mass of literature talking about that, in some dabbling in professional communities, but that wasn't as prominent as it has been in other types of communities, either defined by a social characteristic or in other means. So that was an area where it's emergent, but there's not yet kind of consistent findings in terms of how it affects and may bolster professional communities. But it also does strengthen the notion of sense of belonging. So I just want to wrap that up because there's varying degrees of kind of strengths, various emergence, and different methodologies that are utilized. And so while some may be more research, more kind of controlled trials or randomized, but what we were seeing more kind of standard practices in health and well-being, that is not the case that we see in many of these other domains. In other domains, it's development of language and literature and terminology. It's a qualitative, iterative, oftentimes an interviewing or observation process to really understand the effects and nuances and mechanisms for how relationships were potentially being strengthened or bolstered, or the lack of that effect. So there's a broad range of methodologies, but overall, clinical literature was by far and away the advanced and most mature. I mean, other spaces, there seems to be growing interest and energy, but they're very much generally emergent spaces, and particularly in the need of attention to better understand the nuances for different populations and different community groups or different subgroups that people may be interested in. Now, the literature that we scanned, this came out in 21, so we stopped looking and scanned in 20. So what's to come in terms of all that's been happening over the last 2 years stands to be greatly learned from. So there's many conversations about questions of what role might artists play in helping to heal communities? How do we the potential to offer arts-based interventions in the general population for both acute trauma and experiences, given experiences of the past few years, as well as kind of longstanding structural trauma in terms of social, this kind of structural racism and different notions of social class. So these are very current conversations in the policy space. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to learn from what's being learned in kind of clinical settings. So hopefully I gave a high-level overview, thinking about some different perspectives in framing and language, hopefully some potential connections for synergies and different ways of knowing of how we understand this evidence base. I just want to take just a couple minutes because I'd love to very briefly kind of tag on some current look at the potential role of artists, those who are seeking trained in some sort of creative form, who are seeking to earn a livelihood around this. That's the kind of artists that I'm describing. And I just want to offer some shifting perspectives on who those artists are and how they might work. This comes from a study I did with Rachel Skaggs at Ohio State University. This was put out in 2017, but it's kind of, how does the public understand artists? So kind of hearkening back to that early policy conversation I had around a focus on economic impact, a certain focus on attendance, that kind of stemmed from a political mixture of kind of ousting and kind of shying away from artists, being seen as extreme, not necessarily contributing to society. They kind of worked alone in a studio where the starving artist is stereotyped. That's what was. And this is trying to understand how are artists understood today in the current landscape. And what you see here, and this is a broad general population public opinion poll representative of the US adult population over age 18. And what we see here is that, yes, certainly publicly, we understand artists as individuals wanting to seek and earn money, but approximately 2/3 of the population defines them best as something other than that. They see them as individuals who could bring attention to community concerns or causes. They're collaborators, trying to think about solving new problems, or represent various community members and kind of speak up, provide voice for those who may not have it or be able to enact it. So we're seeing the notion of a greater acceptance of artists as contributing in other domains of social policy. And so really trying to think about what is the potential for artists to be a part of these notions, the current notions of the need for healing within our communities broadly. I just want to offer this more recent statistic as well. Again, this was a next iteration of that similar public opinion poll, so representative of the national adult population in the US. This data was collected in April of 22. And in addition to kind of what were their perceptions of the roles that artists could play, I mean, just generally, are people accepting of the idea that artists could contribute to healing our communities, a potential recovery from the pandemic? And what we see here is over half of the US adult population said yes. And the other half either kind of was indifferent, that saying, you know, that artists play the same role as we all have in being able to help to contribute. But over 50% said absolutely yes in terms of positive ideas and ways to contribute, as we did some of the language that we described earlier in the conceptual framework. That language was reflected. And additionally, this is not yet published yet, so I just want to put that caveat around it. But we tested this and tried to look for differences, certainly by all the kind of standard socio-demographics that we see differences in around arts participation or support for the arts. And additionally, political ideology. Typically, we see individuals who have more of a liberal political affiliation being supportive of arts in general. And in all the different ways that we tested it, we did not find any difference. So this is not being necessarily driven by any particular segment or political ideology from the adult population in the US, but broadly read, we see that there's a large swath, over half the US population is for the amenable and seeing artists being able to contribute to our overall communal healing from the pandemic and all else that we've experienced the last few years. So I'll close with that. I'm going to say thank you so much for your time and attention. And Catherine, if there are any questions or ideas that I could expand on for you, I'd be happy to.
Jennifer, thank you. That was so interesting and really forces us all to take a step back and look at the broad picture of the way the arts is affecting our daily movement through community, right? And I'm finding lots of bridges between what you're talking about and the studies that you've done, which have been quite comprehensive, to the work we're doing with choral. So as we wait for, I'm not seeing questions right now in our question and answer section, but I have a couple questions for you. So I'm just very curious how you see the overlay of what you've learned. I'm thinking about trauma, both individual and collective, and I'm thinking about the traumas that are continuing on a cultural level right now, and how you see the arts as potential healers of collective trauma based on your studies.
Sure.
It's a big question.
It's a big question. So I think at a first layer, we have the opening back up, right? Events are happening again. So we have that kind of baseline level of people being able to enjoy a concert, being able to enjoy a performance, just being in festival, being in place with each other and an experience. So that's kind of baseline level. But I think additionally, being able to facilitate in a more focused manner some of the healing and processing that I hear about, we all have our own experiences as well, is incredibly important, or even having that release of stress, some time for escape, even if it's not a structured therapeutic process, which, on a large scale, that notion of escape and truly being able to access that idea is really important. And we're also, some of the conversations that I'm a part of, and this is tied with also workforce challenges for artists and creatives, but thinking about how to leverage the skill sets, the mindsets, the approaches that many individuals can bring to bear, and intersect that with other domains of care, of giving, of healing, of processing, that with kind of the right mixture of expertise could really leverage those individuals, value and account for and integrate their expertise as well to really help a broader set of individuals. I think a lot about different programs that are underway in terms of songwriters in Nashville, for example. I used to be based in Nashville, and there's a large effort there because there's a critical mass of songwriters in that area, but to help them working with medical and clinical professionals for the treatment of PTSDs for veterans. And through a songwriting process. And that kind of, I'm not doing that initiative due justice at all in my description, but really leveraged individuals with different areas of expertise and skill sets working towards a collective way to, provide care and processing. So I really think there's a tremendous amount of potential for that, and some of it's being tapped, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity to take that to a larger scale from what I've seen, and stitching together different interests that are currently underway to help, to assist with healing and processing, both acute and more collective. Also thinking about how do we create more employment opportunities for individuals who may have had to pivot, or the landscape is shifting in that regard, and some other factors. And also, I think importantly, thinking about not just arts as we may have once thought about it in terms of benchmark arts, but varying that and having the individuals who are conveying that, instructing that, and providing these different opportunities being more reflective of the diversity of our population. So I think there's a tremendous potential to kind of harness that, and that the moment may be extremely ripe for that.
Thank you so much for that answer. It is it's a big question, and it's a comprehensive concept, because I'm seeing it in our circles, right, in the healthcare professions, the way that meaning making in community through creative acts are really helping individuals and groups of individuals to process their trauma, that they are realizing they're not the only ones having that experience. And by seeing themselves reflected in each other's pieces of art, I agree with you that the potential is huge. And that's just in my very small sphere. We have a couple of questions that have come in, so I'm gonna read you one of those. This is from Kathy Hasty. She says, what can be done to support training for artists as change agents in complex problems? I was trained in that by local arts groups.
Sure. So this is a really big question that I'm in conversations with in terms of workforce development stakeholders, and also my other hat of working the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project. Very briefly, that is an effort to understand those who've gone through have earned a degree from an arts, design, or creative field, different career outcomes and their experiences. That's a research effort there. So that brings in the hat of how might this affect post-secondary training for artists and creatives and designers as well? What is the potential there? I know there are different programs across starting up or in the US who are undertaking this, but thinking about how is that embedded in either the post-secondary training for individuals earning degrees here, or what other types of professional development opportunities might be funded. And currently there are some conversations, it has to be resourced in some manner, but thinking about how to potentially leverage workforce development and economic development dollars to help underwrite some of these training opportunities for artists who may have mastered their aesthetic skill set, but do not necessarily have the translation experience or training. So those are some programs that exist that I've heard about and aware of. I think there's also, again, this notion of thinking about how we need the healing. There's also very real workforce and employment challenges, and really think about how is there be structured investments in tapping the skills and expertise of artists to help with these different challenges that we're collectively facing.
So Jennifer, we have so many great questions. I'm trying to decide which ones to ask you. Thank you for that thoughtful answer. I'm gonna ask you one from Donna Mejia. I don't know if I pronounced your name right, so I'll just say Donna. She is saying this: an interesting sentiment to consider in my own research. Black folks don't need to prove art is meaningful. Our artistic culture is the first thing to be attacked in any hegemonic effort to control us. The need to quantify art's impact is at times considered an effort to control resources through predominantly white cultural structures. This is a very complicated and nuanced question. I invite you to know whatever you wish to comment on is just the start of a larger conversation we all need to have.
Yeah, so first, thank you for your comment and bringing this out here. Absolutely. I think, when I first started and was working in this area, I was like, of course we know. I mean, the individuals have their experiences, they know what they feel, they know what they think when they've done something or why they enjoy it. They know that visceral feeling. So why do we need these words necessarily? Do we have to put it into words, and do we have to measure it? And really, from my starting perspective was that policy perspective, that really that simple statistic that I showed earlier around the attendance of those benchmark arts as it's no longer used, and that conversation has evolved, but that was kind of the driving statistic. It would come out every couple of years and would be the driver of so much policy discourse, and would be the driver of where investments were made. So, in my own reflection of that notion of measurement, to be able to have currencies is really important in a lot of policy conversations in the distribution and investment of resources. That's kind of my point. But to this regard, kind of what those measures are they fair of who is subject to those measures? That is an ongoing challenge and consideration throughout all these processes that I didn't quite get into in what I shared today, but has been integral and is a continued conversation and grappling, as we evolve this work.
I agree, and I know that. So my creative arts therapy program here at Children's Hospital Colorado, we're very integrated in the diversity, health, equity, and inclusion efforts, mainly because we see, and our leaders in those areas are seeing the impact and potential for the arts to help people evolve their own consciousness and to help people become the agents of change they wish to be by allowing themselves to feel deeply the impact of the content that we're sharing, if that makes sense. So I just appreciate all the different ways that the arts can help us to evolve our community awareness and resource distribution, as you said. So thank you for that. So Dr. Jennifer, I think we might need to close up. I really just want to express my gratitude for your thoughtfulness, the comprehensive nature of your presentation, the extensive nature of your research. It's clearly impactful in so many domains. I want to thank you today for being with us. I also want to let everyone know that we do have a new lecture next month on March 17th, and that will be Dr. Jeremy Noble. He is the founder and president of the Foundation for Art and Healing. His work involves how creative expression mitigates illness and enhances well-being. He has become a prominent advocate for creative engagement, ancillary to and integrated with traditional medical care as a pathway to healing. He is board certified in both preventive medicine and internal medicine. And Dr. Noble also holds a master's degree in epidemiology and health policy from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So that will be next month. Dr. Novak-Leonard, thank you for today. What an enriching hour we've spent. And for everyone who's in attendance, please know that this is our website address. We have a pretty extensive website where you can see all of our previous lectures in our lecture series. And we have many partners, both locally and nationally, some even internationally. If you're interested in being one, please reach out to us through this website address or through the lecture notes. Thank you all, and we'll see you next month.